Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll sink our teeth into the other invasion of Poland in 1939. The one carried out by the Soviet Union, which still generates spirited debates today, both online and in the arena of international politics. Hi, Jesse. As I keep saying, another week, another podcast. Here we are again. I think this really is becoming some sort of a catchphrase, probably. So this is the fourth episode, if I'm not mistaken, we're recording on Poland. So we're doing quite a bit, but I think it's justified because not only is it the opening stage of the war, it's a campaign that is quite often overlooked. It's also justified because, let's face it, the Poles are really at the receiving end, not only during the fight or the fighting and the invasions, but also then, of course, during the occupations, both by the Soviets and of course, the Germans. And I think it's really, really important that we shed more light into this and talk about it in more detail.
And I think that the relevance of the Polish campaign even extends into the post-war period, right? Because Poland is at the heart of some disagreements in the settlements in 1945, because as we know, the borders get radically changed in favor of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union gets a role in Poland, essentially running it as a satellite state for many decades afterwards. And even today, there is talk about this, let's say, difference of interpretations, if I'm being charitable, about Poland's role in 1939, where many observers in today's Russia have a particular view that clashes with mostly what's considered a reasonable historical interpretation here in Europe and in North America about what Poland did in 1939 and Poland's subsequent role in the Russian view, let's say. So, lots of connections to today, as is so often the case with history. And as is so often the case with history, we've got to look at a bit of context because we want to catch all of you listeners up, refresh you a little bit. Before we jump into the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939, of course, the Germans are first out of the starting blocks here. They're the ones who invade Poland first. It all kind of comes to a head, let's say. There are longer-term causes, but the practical circumstances that allow the war to begin, it's the Nazi-Soviet pact, where the Soviet Union and Germany agree, we're going to divide up Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, and we can do what we want in those spheres of influence. And Poland is divided between them. And so that's kind of the German cue. All right, now we don't have to worry too much about the Soviets. Even if Britain and France react, we can invade Poland, which they do, of course, on September 1st, 1939. And within about 6 weeks, they've essentially defeated Poland. You can listen to our previous episodes if you want to get the nitty-gritty on all of that. Very interesting and tragic campaign. And the Soviet invasion begins a little bit later. It begins halfway through on the 17th of September, 1939. And that's what we're going to focus on today. Did I leave out a piece of key context that you want our listeners to be reminded of, Matthias, before we dive in?
Well, maybe a small thing. I think, as you said, we talked about this in the previous episode, but it might be of interest and important for the context. When you look at the Polish border as it sits and stands in 1939 and compare that, for example, to the line drawn on the map by the Stalin-Hitler or Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, whichever you want to call it, that's interesting because when Poland is established after the First World War, it's established along what is called the Curzon line. So after the British foreign minister, then there is the big war between Poland and the Soviet Union, as a consequence of which Poland extends to the east. And large areas of these territories that they conquer now, of course, had been Russian beforehand during the First World War. Before that, part of the Tsarist Empire, just like Warsaw itself, for example. But what you also find in there is a difference in population. whereas you have in the western part quite a strong German minority. In the central part, you have a very homogeneous, you might say, Polish community. Some other factions thrown in there. You can debate where
quite a large Jewish community in the
That's
cities
exactly,
as well. Yeah,
that's what I was just going to say. So you can debate where's the Jewish population fit in there? Do you class them as Polish or are they separate? Oh, that's perhaps a debate for another day. But in the east, it's very different. These territories they've occupied, because this is predominantly Belarusians, that is Ukrainians in the south. You have in that particular part, roughly speaking, just over a third of Poles living. All the other nationalities are mainly the ones I mentioned. So in the north, you've got Belarusians, in the south, Ukrainians, and again, a large Jewish population. And I keep using this example. I think I've done it in the previous episodes as well. To me personally, the best embodiment of this is just the city of Lviv, Lemberg. I think there's another one which I've forgotten now, the other pronunciation. Lviv. So if you just look at all these different names for one particular city, that already tells you that there is something happening, there's something going on. Things are changing and shifting. And I think that's quite important, because this is, and we'll explain this in more detail later on, this is, of course, the official reason as to why the Soviets then tell the world that it is okay for them to invade Poland, because that's not invasion. We're just protecting our people, as they would say. So a very, very different structure. It's really interesting. I mean, we're not really talking about modern politics here on this podcast, because it's a history podcast. But if you just take this, just the surface, very, very broad brush, there are some very interesting parallels to what you can see being played out in Eastern Europe today. But as I said, this is not a politics podcast, so let's rewind and go back to 1939, probably.
Yeah, I think the nature of Poland, we did mention in the previous episode, there was these two kind of competing visions of what Poland could be when the country is established or re-established after the First World War. Should it be a much larger, sprawling confederation of Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians? Or should it be a more compact, very clear, large, overwhelming majority ethnic Polish state? And they end up in between, as you say, with this extension of the borders. The Curzon line was never sunk in stone, let's say, as the Germans would say, in Stein gemeißelt. So it was never carved in stone. It was what the Allies thought the border should be. And in the end, it turned out to be farther to the east.
Can I just point out for 1 second to our listeners here, if you do speak German, that was actually not as Jesse said, that wasn't said in German. That was actually Austrian. There we are. That's
even better.
I just mean your accent.
Even better. Oh, my accent. Okay, I thought maybe the expression was an origin of Austrian origin. Yes, my accent is Austrian when I speak German. Apologies, everybody who finds that funny, but I'm very proud of my Austrian accent. In any case, where was I here? Yes. And Poland, I also think this is an important piece of context. Poland is not alone in being a non-homogeneous state in the interwar period. All of these states that are created, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, even the expanded Romania, even Hungary, even though to a lesser extent, these new states that come from the new order in Europe and the Versailles Peace Treaty system in Europe after the First World War, part of the thinking behind them is they should be nation states, but in practice, they're almost like tiny multi-ethnic empires, if you will. It's true there's a new dominant group. It's not the Austrians anymore, for example, or it's not the Russians in the Polish case. It's somebody else. It's the Czechs, or it's the Serbs, or it's the Poles, but there are large minority groups in all of these states. So Poland is not some unique case, which sometimes is focused on, that, Poland wasn't really legitimate because of this or that, or the borders weren't legitimate. Well, borders don't generally go along ethnic lines until after 1945, and even then. In any case, so let's cut to the chase here, folks, with all our context making. The Soviets invade on September 17th. Now, there's some discussion as to exactly why. Of course, publicly, as you referred to, Matthias, they say, well, we're trying to help our fellow members of the greater Russian nation, Belarusians and Ukrainians. But there's some thought about, what's Stalin really thinking? Because Stalin was not one necessarily to do something out of nostalgic or emotive reasons. He usually had calculations about this a little bit more. There's one sort of school of thought, let's say, that puts more focus on, well, he's expecting a big war. He's expecting an imperialist war. This is the sort of Leninist thinking that eventually all the imperialist powers are going to go to war against each other. And we need to benefit from that in any way that we can. So we aren't going to have any scruples. We're going to cooperate with Nazi Germany if that's going to allow us to get an advantage when this big imperialist war is going to come anyway and their whole system is going to collapse, right? Another one is that he's just interested in security buffers. This also assumes he thinks a war might come in the future, but that he says, well, we're going to take advantage of any opportunity to just get more territory. It doesn't matter who lives there, doesn't matter what their ethnicity is, doesn't matter historically if they were part of the old empire or not. We just want more territory. So that's another potential explanation in the mix. And then finally, there's maybe that Poland is a bit of a special case, that it represents this imperialist, illegitimate Versailles Treaty that excludes the Soviet Union or Bolshevik Russia at the time, that there's a bit of revanchisme, as they say, wanting to get revenge for the territory that Poland acquired during the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921. So there's a bit of a, let's say, a bit of a special case for Poland in all of his thinking. Can we read Stalin's mind? No, but I think those are kind of some of the ingredients that we can think about when we're thinking about the reason for Poland, the invasion of Poland.
Absolutely right. And as you say, we just don't know. We can't look into his head anyway, because he's no longer with us, but no one's head. You can also look at things like this whole idea of socialism or communism in one country, which of course had been announced in the 1920s, but that was only really the consequence of the Soviets getting a bloody nose in the campaign against Poland in 1920. So then say, well, no, we're just going to keep socialism and communism here in our country. That is not really convincing. And as you say, in whatever shape or form, whatever they do and whatever they did is trying to get more territory for whatever reason. And as you say, we're not entirely sure why. But it plays out on the battlefield and in the political arena that this is actually the outcome of that, whatever the underlying thought behind that is. Absolutely right.
There is another public justification that is still part of the current debate sometimes about why the Soviet Union invaded, and that is that the Polish state had ceased to exist, and therefore we had no choice. There was anarchy on our borders, which was announced at the time as well as one of the reasons. I just saw a YouTube comment in that direction the other day, I think. Yeah, maybe it was publicly announced, but I don't think that holds a lot of historical water. For one thing, on the 17th of September, the Polish army is still there. It's still fighting the Germans. It does, to some extent, also fight the Soviets, as we'll discuss a little further along in this episode. And the government is also still functioning. The army still listens to what the ministers say. And even then, you could also argue that the Polish eventually had a government in exile. So the government does still exist. It never stops existing during the war. So I think this idea that all of a sudden Poland stopped existing and didn't have a government and didn't have an army and didn't have these institutions. Of course, the Germans were in the process of conquering the country, but that's not the same thing as saying on 17th September there was no Poland. I don't think that's a historically sustainable point of view, but you do hear it.
You do hear, and of course, as you said, that was something that was used very, very much at the time. And again, the context here is quite interesting, because when you lift it up a little bit and take it away from, let's call it from a Soviet point of view, the Western Front, which is Poland, look further to the east, there is stuff happening at that time as well. Because in September, there is a big battle against the Japanese, the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, and that is a Soviet victory. So you might say before that the Soviets were looking at some sort of two-front war. This is now gone out. They signed a treaty with the Japanese, and there is peace on their Eastern Front, which of course also means that in addition to everything that they signed with the Germans, the fact that Poland has practically already more or less been defeated by the 17th of September, it makes it even easier for them to invade. And of course, as you said, looking at this and saying, well, Poland doesn't exist anymore, and this is why we need to go in there. I mean, this is all a created argument, isn't it? But this was exactly the argument that the Soviets put forward to the Poles and also to the world, because that sounds much, much better, saying, well, you have ceased to exist, and that means we need to protect our people, rather than saying, well, we just want to do a land grab here. So that is not particularly convincing. And it's interesting. I mean, we normally don't really do long quotes, but I've got one here, which I think sums all this up. So this is on the 17th of December. Molotov, so the Soviet foreign minister, summons the Polish ambassador, a chap called Zhibowski, and he basically hands over a declaration. And I'm just going to read this out because it sums up everything that Jesse, that you've just said. And he said, Warsaw as a capital of Poland no longer exists. The Polish government has disintegrated and no longer shows any sign of operation. This means that the Polish state and its government have de facto ceased to exist. Again, exactly what you just said. Accordingly, the agreements concluded between the USSR and Poland have thus lost their validity. Left to her own devices and bereft of leadership, Poland has become a suitable field for all kinds of hazards and surprises, which may constitute a threat to the USSR. For these reasons, the Soviet government, who has hitherto been neutral, can no longer preserve a neutral attitude and ignore these facts. Under these circumstances, the Soviet government has directed the High Command of the Red Army to order troops to cross the frontier and to take under their protection the life and property of the population of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. So that basically, again, sums up everything that we've just said. Of course, you might say it's an utterly created argument, but this is what they put forward. And this is what the Poles are now confronted with. And of course, that means that, Poland, you might perhaps say, is now, at least for a short period of time, in a bit of a state of shock. I mean, Molotov also makes that public then. He then declares via public radio podcast the same thing again, that all treaties are null and void, that the Polish government had abandoned the people, the Polish state doesn't exist anymore, and that's the reason why the Soviet Union needs to invade. So that's the public explanation given to the Soviet people as well. And that is a problem for Poland. When you go back to our previous episodes and we looked at the fighting that you have in the western part of Poland, we talked about this. I mean, they were always on the back foot simply because of numbers, because of equipment, the army not being as modern as the German army. But they do fight well the first few days. We analyzed that in depth in the other episodes, and there's some very heavy fighting, and the Germans are not happy with their performance. However, by the 17th of September, it is pretty obvious that this is only going one way. Now, the Polish problem is that they had, in their war plans, concentrated very much on a war against Germany. Now, the question is, why is that? Is that because they thought that the Soviets wouldn't invade? Did they believe what the Soviets were telling them? Or is it just the realization that, a two-front war is completely futile, so we don't even have to plan for this, so let's concentrate our planning against the more obvious threat, you might say. But the problem that comes out of this is then that in the eastern territory of Poland, you've got hardly any Polish troops. So to begin with, you're looking at around 20 battalions of basically border guards. That's about 20,000 people. And these are now facing the might of the Soviet army as it invades. So you can see, again, right from the beginning, in this particular part of the operation, Poland's on the back foot. It's actually more on the back foot, and it's pretty obvious to everybody that this is not going to go well.
It's a pretty clear-cut case, I think. Militarily, they have absolutely no chance whatsoever of any kind of meaningful resistance. Well, militarily meaningful. Obviously, politically, you can have meaningful resistance even if you know militarily the situation is not going to work out in your favor. But militarily, they have essentially no chance when the Red Army decides to go in. I did want to wedge in a couple more details because I really think the build up to the invasion, the justification for the invasion, is one of the most historically significant parts. Before we get into the actual operation, one of the things we're talking about the Red Army and how geez, I'm having a German brain day. How überlegen it is. How much larger, how much more overwhelming force it can bring to bear on the eastern part of Poland than the Polish army can. One of the messages that's disseminated to the Red Army troops to explain to them why they're going to be marching across the border into Poland is that Polish workers, the Polish proletariat, has been oppressed by their evil capitalist landowning lords, the Polish pans, lords in Polish, or Mr., I guess, these days. And that the Polish workers and peasants were rising up against these evil lords, and that the Red Army therefore had an ideological obligation to support them, which is, of course, I'm not sure how much colorful vocabulary I can use on the air here for this podcast, but it's a bunch of horse droppings, because there were no such rebellions and uprisings of Polish workers against their lords. This was just another thing that's cooked up by the Soviets to justify. As far as, I'm glad you brought up the situation with the Japanese, because of course there's also the question, well, why wouldn't the Soviets have just invaded at the same time as the Germans? Once the Germans make such quick progress, the Soviets are a little bit concerned. Maybe the Germans are not going to stick to the agreement that we had for where our zone in Poland should be. So now we kind of want to accelerate things. And the situation with Japan is something that held them back a little bit. The Germans, from what I've read, were actually quite keen to have the Soviets come in as soon as possible. And we're hoping that the Soviets would come in all the way at the beginning of September, because of course, if we put ourselves in the German shoes, they're a bit worried about what the British and French might do once that declaration of war comes. We talked about that scene where the translator comes in and translates that there's been a declaration of war from the UK, and Hitler sort of is surprised at first, right? So the Germans are concerned about that. The Soviets don't come in right away. They do some stuff though. And here I think this is also relevant to the debate about why they invaded, to the debate justifying or not justifying it, even though I think it's a fairly one-sided debate. But still, given current events, I think it's worth hammering the nail all the way in. The Soviets allow, even before they enter the fight, they allow the Germans to use radar facilities in Minsk, for example, or radio facilities in Minsk for the Luftwaffe to be able to use. And they allow the use of some naval facilities at their Arctic naval base in Murmansk, for example. So they are allowing the Germans to do things to facilitate their invasion before the so-called collapse of the Polish state by September 17th. In addition, on the 8th of September, so this is like a week in, the German ambassador to the Soviet Union, a guy by the name of Schulenburg, he sends a telegram back to Berlin, and he basically says, you can look it up, folks, if you can find it online. It's telegram number 300 from the German ambassador back to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Berlin, September 8th, and he basically says, this is what the Soviets are telling me about our invasion. And it's a short quote here. This is more or less what the telegram says. Very urgent. I have just received the following telephone message from Molotov. And now this is Molotov's statement, according to Schulenburg. I have received your communication regarding the entry of German troops into Warsaw. Please convey my congratulations and greetings to the German government, Molotov. And then Schulenburg ends his telegram. So to remind everybody, September 8th is when the Germans basically reach the city limits of Warsaw. They don't fully get in, but obviously they're going to tell the Soviets, hey, we're doing great. We're already in Warsaw. And the Soviets out and out congratulate them. So I think that reveals something of Soviet thinking as well, and puts another nail in the coffin of the idea that, well, they were just neutrally observing, and then all of a sudden there was no Poland, and they had to step in to secure everything and make it safe. So there you have it.
That's exactly. And again, coming back to the point that we made earlier, I mean, it just looks better, doesn't it, on the international stage and international scene? because we do have this British guarantee, this British-Polish agreement that whatever happens, well, Britain will basically fight for a free and independent Poland. Now, when you look at the terms of that particular agreement in a bit more detail, you will then see that in the more secret parts, it's very clearly directed against Germany. And it's interesting that when the Soviets finally decide to invade, the Poles then go to Britain and say, well, do something about this, and say, well, that's not our business. If you read the treaty, if you read the small print, you will see that's just directed against Germany. And it's the same
French
again,
as well.
And the French, we talked about this last time as well. So this whole idea, this agreement that the French army would launch a major offensive into Germany within 2 weeks of a declaration of war by Germany against Poland. Of course, that hasn't happened. So again, they're on the back foot. But of course, the Soviets know that this agreement exists, and they think, do we need to get involved that early? Do we let the Germans do most of the fighting to weaken the Poles, and then we just sweep in and take over? Because this is, in essence, exactly what happens. I mean, it leads to another very interesting factor I always find, and I've used that a number of times even in teaching, when you look at things like the development of international politics, of war aims and all these things. So if you look at the Anglo-Polish agreement and what the French are saying as well, so it's all about the existence of a free and independent Poland. And now, stay with me, folks, for this little experiment, this mental experiment. So we now fast forward all the way to 1944. So lots of stuff has happened in the Second World War. Germany invades the Soviet Union. By 1944, Germany is pushed out again, and they stand on the borders of Germany. And the Soviet Union has now taken over all of the former Polish territory. And everybody knows that the puppet regime that's been installed, that's not free, democratic, and open. So in a way, you might say, by the spirit of these agreements from 1939, what the Allies should have done now is make peace with Germany, declare war on the Soviet Union. Of course, that doesn't happen, because things have changed, you've gone through war. But also, if you take this back to 1939, I think that's also very, very interesting, this interpretation of this treaty. And you might say, particularly from a Polish point of view, this is where the Western Allies already lose the moral high ground in World War II. It's quite a blow. It's completely overlooked. No one talks about this. But to the Poles, this is why they still call this whole episode, the whole development here, that's the great betrayal. And that is still very much with them today. So it's really, really quite interesting when you look at this. I don't think that's how it's seen in other countries. But when you start putting all this together and you look at this, you might say, well, the logical conclusion to all the rhetoric that you had before the invasion of Poland, even by the Germans, would have been that the Allies should have declared war on the Soviet Union as well. Of course, they don't. They say, well, it's very, very different, because the Soviets are just not getting their territories back, but they're protecting their own people, as the Soviets have claimed. But in reality, of course, everyone knows, well, that would just, they would have bitten off too much. They couldn't chew this. So fighting a big war against two of the major European powers, that would have been too much. But it's interesting when you start thinking this through, and I think there's a real clash here between what you want to call it, morality and realpolitik. So what is actually happening? What's the situation on the ground? And what's the realistic approach to all of this? I think that is also a really, really interesting aspect of the whole debate.
Yes, I think there is a fair bit of historical, I don't want to say, maybe bitterness is a bit too harsh in some cases, but I think it hits the target on others in Poland about the actions of the French and British and the Americans then later on in the war. But of course, context is everything, right? The conflict is about Poland in 1939, or it's about German power and imperial desires, but it's also focused on Poland. Whereas later on, the war takes on a whole global character. There are all sorts of different things that come into play. And we're looking at a different political context, right? Of course, the feeling that you mentioned of betrayal on the part of Poland is perfectly understandable. I think it would have been very unreasonable of Britain and France to have declared war on the Soviet Union on September 17th, 1939. This is not a very reasonable or realistic step to have taken if you think about it from...
That would have been quite interesting, yes. The world would look a very different place today, yes.
No question. So in the question of Poland and its freedom and independence, yes, that puts a significant dent in the moral high ground position of the Allies. On the other hand, of course, if you look at the war as a whole, they're still standing on higher moral ground than the Axis was. I think that's probably fairly clear. I hope anyway, although good Lord, the internet has its ways. In any case, here we are, September 17th, the army's on the move. The Red Army is then on the move, and they're not joking around. They bring to the table, according to my notes here, about 470,000 men, 4,000 tanks and armored vehicles, 5,500 guns, and 2,000 planes. And this is overwhelming is not a strong enough word for this force, numerically anyway. Quality-wise, obviously, we see a little later that the Red Army struggles for a while. But numerically, this is absolutely overwhelming force to what the Poles can put against it, given their predicament against the Germans. In fact, quite a few of the Polish units in the eastern part of the country at this time are reservists who are still in the process of being called up, and they're not even fully organized and armed yet. So it's militarily, it's more than unfortunate.
And of course, you mentioned the numbers, absolutely right. And that, of course, is then brought back to the military high command, who obviously already know about the situation. It's absolutely desperate right from the beginning, isn't it, in Poland? And you then have, a bit of a debate, you might say, between the military, so the commander-in-chief, Rudzi Śmigły, again, well, please excuse my Polish pronunciation, my Polish is not particularly great, about how to counter this threat. And of course, in good military fashion, he says, we're going to put up resistance here, we're going to fight. It's going to be a complete desperate struggle, but this is what you need to do. It's actually interesting that the Prime Minister and the President, they're trying to dissuade the army from doing that and say, you know what, why are we fighting? There's nothing there. We don't have troops. So basically what we should be doing is probably fall back, go further to the west, and only fighting withdrawal, self-defense, but don't really engage the Soviets too heavily. Now, the interesting question is, why is that? Is this only because of the military reality that they're facing, or is it also because they're hoping that they might get perhaps some sort of concessions from the Soviets? Because the Soviets, again, when you go to the original reason and the official reason, are not there to occupy. They're basically to liberate, to protect. And maybe, perhaps, you can come to some sort of agreement with them at a later stage. So the Germans perhaps are still being seen as the bigger threat. But when you look at the map, you've got this problem now that the Germans, as you said, they're basically there in Warsaw. They've conquered large parts of Poland. And now you order the troops, at least in theory, to conduct a fighting withdrawal to the west. You don't have any space. That's the problem. You're running out of space at that particular time. And of course, another issue that you have in the Polish system at that time is mainly because of the structure, but also because of the realities of this war that's ongoing now. The communications tends to break down a little bit. So this order, or this idea that they're not really supposed to be putting up stiff resistance and fight, quite often doesn't get passed on to the troops, and they do stand and fight. But you mentioned the numbers. That's a large army that's invading, and to begin with, you're looking at something like 20,000 border guards, badly equipped, in addition to some of these reservists that you mentioned that are still being called up, that are not properly equipped. So it's a very, very one-sided show that you get here.
Yeah, and in terms of the actual fighting, I know of a few instances of some more severe fighting, but of course, in some cases, there's not much fighting to be done. If you're a unit of unarmed reservists, yes, you count in the statistic of how many troops the Poles have in the area, which I think at one point could be interpreted as something like 300,000. But that's definitely a paper army. There's no way that it's got a combat value for 300,000 regular troops. If you're in that situation, you're not going to fight at all. And that repeated itself in numerous places over the course of those couple of weeks when the Red Army is moving in and occupying. There was some stiffer fighting in the town of Grodno, which I think in Belarusian is Hrodno, with a softer G sound. It's in Belarus today. Some Poles were using Molotov cocktails against Soviet tanks before the Finns invented the term, I suppose. There was There was some use of it. So there was some fighting in Grodno, for example, around Lviv. Interestingly enough, the Germans had already reached there. So the Germans' quick advance had brought them into what was supposed to be, according to the pre-war agreement, the Soviet zone. And apparently there was some discussion. Should there be a joint attack? Should we go for Lviv to capture it from both sides between the Germans and the Soviets? So much for neutral Soviets just coming in to protect, right? When you're actively considering joint fighting, never mind complementary invasions. I'm going to get flack for this position, but I don't care. I think historically, sometimes you really have to take a stand. The evidence is clear. In any case, but then the Germans, the agreement is such in the end that, okay, the Germans will simply withdraw from around Lviv and the Soviets will just take it, which then they do. Those to me are some of the kind of highlights / lowlights of the operation. There's some other political aspects that I want to talk about, but Matthias, as far as the military side of the entry of the Red Army is concerned, are there any other points any other clashes that you want to add?
I think we kind of covered it. It's the Poles are really on the back foot. It's obvious they can't win this at the strategic, even the operational level of war. A similar situation to as you might say, as we've said now a number of times, to what happens in the West. So it's a lost cause pretty much from the beginning. That, however, does not mean that the Poles don't stand and fight quite bravely and quite heroically. You already mentioned the one battle. I mean, there are lots of small tactical engagements where the Poles actually do stand and do fight. You have, for example, the Battle of Shatsk, which is fought on the 28th of September, quite late. So the Poles in the end then withdraw, but they inflict relatively heavy casualties on the Soviet forces. So you do get this, but this is not enough. It simply isn't enough to stop the advancing Soviet troops from doing whatever they do. And the further in you go into this campaign, of course, the worse it gets, because, as I said earlier, you're simply running out of room to maneuver. And this is then where, in the end, you have the Germans and the Soviets meeting, dividing up the territory. And I think it's probably something for the slightly more political debate, but Brest is a very famous example, which is seized by the Germans. We come back to that, the famous parade in a minute, perhaps. It's seized by the Germans, but it's then handed over to the Soviets as per the agreement of the 1939 pact between Germany and the Soviet Union. So once this is happening, I mean, there is not much that the Poles really can do. It's a complete lost cause. They all realize this, and relatively quickly in this phase, then also the order is given for the Poles, but basically get out if you can. So we talked about in the other podcast, so try to get into Romania, from Romania somewhere else. And of course, again, if we lift it up and we jump forward a little bit, a lot of Poles actually do get out, and the Polish army continues to fight. And you've got the Polish Corps that fights, for example, at Cassino in 1944. So all these things are happening, but that doesn't really help in 1939. So no, Poland is really the back foot.
It is, and in terms of the Soviet invasion, there was also not much that the British or French could reasonably have done in terms of their military means. There's very little. There were a few sort of pie-in-the-sky thoughts, well, we could bomb Baku and damage the oil production there. But I mean, this is really stretching it as far as what was reasonable. The idea of the French doing something about the German invasion by entering Western Germany, I think that's got a lot more meat to it in terms of militarily what theoretically they could have done. But as far as the Soviets are concerned, it's very, very difficult to say. Shall we say a word about the parade now? Because this is quite an interesting...
Yes.
Indeed. So, as you mentioned, the Germans get far enough, they capture Brest or Brest-Litovsk. It's famous, of course, because that's where the peace treaty was signed between Bolshevik Russia and the Central Powers in the First World War. And they decide, hey, look, this all worked out. Our plan worked. We're going to have a joint parade where we're going to have our generals there. They're going to review our guys marching around. It's a propaganda exercise. And it's one that sends a message that we're cooperating. It's not one that sends a message of the Soviet Union was neutral, doesn't love that the Germans did this and just stepped in because it had to. Absolutely not. The two most famous faces at that parade, I guess you could say, are the German general Heinz Guderian and the Soviet general Semyon Krivoshein. Now, what's ironic in a way about Krivoshein being the commander who's there is that he happens to be Jewish. And he's sitting there next to, Nazi German. Not that every individual German officer or soldier was totally convinced of Nazi ideology, but they're serving the Nazi government, of course. And you have Krivoshein, a Jewish Soviet citizen, sitting there next to them. And also, ironically, I thought, is that because they spoke to each other, but they didn't speak to each other in Russian, because it's unlikely that Guderian is going to be able to speak fluent Russian. They didn't speak to each other in German, because Krivoshein didn't speak fluent German. English was not the international language at the time. French was still. So anybody who's been educated still in the 1920s or 30s is going to have some French. And so they spoke to each other in French, which I don't know. It's not a funny historical event because obviously it's laden with tragic consequences for millions of people, millions of Poles in particular, and Polish Jews as well. But the fact that you have a Jewish Soviet general and then a German general serving the Nazi government, parading their troops together and then speaking French to each other, I don't know. Maybe I'm just too much of a nerd and I don't have a social life, but this blows my mind. This is very entertaining if you can look past all the tragedy that it also encapsulates. I don't know.
Well, that as you say, that was the reality of the early 20th century. So French being the lingua franca, so not English. Quite often, actually, in that part of the world, of course, you would speak German. A lot of people there would speak German. So probably when you go to foreign language, probably the first foreign language, generally speaking, was French, particularly internationally. So if you want to become a diplomat, that's the first language that you learned. Even at schools in those days, most of the time, French was still the first foreign language, followed by English. But in that part of the world, German at that stage was still seen as a very, very important language as well. And of course, not only, it doesn't apply now to this guy in particular, but generally speaking, when you look at the Jewish community, of course, they spoke Yiddish, which is basically a German dialect. So that's another interesting factor that gets thrown in there. So languages, yes, absolutely fascinating. What a coincidence, you might say. What a story that is. And then you have this big parade, and that hammers home to everybody that, well, you know what, this is over. And as you said, I think the symbolism is also really important here, that it is Brest. Yes, it's there, it's in the center, it's an important fortress town. But there's also another reason as to why you have a parade there and nowhere else. Because this is, as you said, this is Brest. Brest-Litovsk is where the peace treaty had been signed in the First World War. So you now have, when the First World War, you had this peace coming to Germany and Russia and the Central Powers, you might say, in Russia. And now you're reforging this friendship, this bond, whatever you want to call it. So that's also quite an interesting symbolic act as to why this is chosen. It's also interesting when you look at some of the accounts from the people who were there, how they talk about each other, how they talk about the different armies, the different soldiers. There wasn't that much interaction, really, to be honest. They tried to keep them relatively separate, but of course you do have a little bit, and that's quite interesting as well. So, for example, I know mainly the German accounts that comment on the Soviet soldiers and talk about their rugged appearance and bad uniforms and all this, but obviously they're doing a good job, some of them said, because they helped us in defeating Poland. So interesting. So again, you might say to a degree, the stereotypes that you have in nations, in militaries, are reinforced here. And of course, that is one contributing factor as to why you then go into 1941, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. But we're jumping ahead. We are jumping ahead. So let's rewind again. Let's rein ourselves in and go back to 1939.
All right, so there are a couple of other points that I want to bring up before we wrap this episode up here that I think are relevant to rounding off the invasion and conquest of Poland by Germany and the Soviet Union. One of them, I think, is let's finish off then the topic maybe of the cooperation between the two. And that is, there's another meeting between them that takes place, I think, on the 28th of September. And they're sort of fine-tuning, the Germans and Soviets are, they're fine-tuning what the situation is on the ground. Because, of course, they have this agreement from August, Nazi-Soviet pact, They sketch out what the zones are going to be in the future for spheres of influence. But the invasion goes slightly differently. We've referred several times to the Germans having been quicker than anticipated, get farther. So what happens is they continue their cooperation, active cooperation, and modify those zones to reflect a little bit more what's happening on the ground. And essentially, Germany gets more of Poland, and the Soviets are obviously not too worried about protecting the people from anarchy who are in that zone. They just let the Germans have it, in exchange for Lithuania going over to the Soviet sphere of influence, which originally was supposed to be in the German sphere of influence, and they modify the agreement then at the end of September. So this very, let's say, tight cooperation continues on, and I think further undermines the idea that the Soviets were neutral and then just stepped in because out of the goodness of their hearts, essentially, right? So I think that deserves mention. So we have this continued cooperation, but I don't want us to get too caught up in the politics with forgetting the human side of things. I mean, although the fighting is much less, there's still a human cost. Matthias, you can probably speak to that.
Well, the casualty numbers, when you look at them for a campaign like this and the territory that's then, do you want to call it liberated or seized or occupied? That depends on your point of view, obviously, as we've discussed, are actually quite light on both sides during the campaign. I mean, every human life is a tragedy, obviously, but when you look at the figures, and particularly if you put that into context of that time, so what's the frame of reference these people have? The frame of reference is probably the First World War, perhaps in that part of the world, the 1920 war. So the casualties are, they're debated, as always. It's a particular problem when you look at the Eastern Front during World War II, whatever shape or form. Soviet casualty figures are extremely unreliable. There's a lot of propaganda in there. It's very difficult trying to get to the bottom of things. So it goes from the left of arc to the right of arc. So, for example, in October 1939, so when the whole thing is over, Molotov reports to the Supreme Soviet that the casualties that the Soviets have sustained during this campaign is 737 deaths and 1,862 wounded. So that's extremely low. People think, well, that's probably not true. There are other numbers, estimates that go up to somewhere in the region of about 3,000 dead and, roughly speaking, 10,000 wounded. That's the 3-to-1 ratio. That would make sense. Somewhere in that region. No one really knows. But even if you go to the extreme and say 3,000 dead, 10,000 wounded, that is still quite light for the large chunk of territory that they seize, which again shows you the desperate situation that the Polish army had been in right from the beginning. They're simply not able to put up a very stiff and successful defense. Again, on the Polish side, we're probably looking at somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 dead. Again, numbers are a little bit debated, but a bit more reliable. But what is perhaps more important in the Polish case is also, of course, the large number of troops that the Soviets capture. And again, there's a bit of debate over that. It's somewhere in the region between 200 and 400 to 450,000 soldiers. So the simple fact that there's such a big, from left of arc to right of arc, already tells you a bit about the confusion there, the Soviet approach to things. Why are they counting these people? How many are they executing? Are they shooting? We'll come back to that in another episode. So there is that. But this is, of course, that's a big drain on Poland, on Polish society. And of course, the other big problem is because neither side had declared war, because the Soviets said we don't have to declare war. We're just going in there to protect our people. So these were not necessarily treated as prisoners of war. Then, of course, on top of that, you've got the problem that the Soviets didn't sign the international agreement. So they didn't feel bound to look after the prisoners of war in a proper way. And that, of course, has all knock-on effects for the occupation, for the fate of the Poles. But I think we leave that for another episode.
Yes, I think we want to do another episode, at least one, on the occupations of Poland on both sides, because war is politics by other means, as Clausewitz would say. And so the political goal has not been fully achieved by the Germans or the Soviets, even though the military campaign has now come to an end. So we will talk about the occupations and all the atrocities that go along with them in a future episode. For today, we'll wrap it up there. This was our look at the Soviet invasion of Poland, which I think is worth a lot of attention given how relevant it is today. given the political situation in Eastern Europe, given today's tensions between Poland, Russia, and Ukraine and Belarus, places we've mentioned numerous times in this episode, still not getting along with tragic consequences. So that's it for today. Folks out there, listeners, viewers, we hope that you enjoyed that discussion. If you want to support what we do here at the podcast, you can do that. You can support us directly and make episodes like this one possible. You can do it by going to bothsidesofthewire.com and becoming a podcast supporter. You can even get access to exclusive material there in our war room. And you can try that out all for a 1-month free trial by using the code DEEPDARKWOODS. So we hope to see you in the war room. And otherwise, we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. All right, so it says we are recording. Here we go.
We're looking dapper as ever. There we go. Huh.
Was that an attempt at a Soviet-style "Ura" as we fix bayonets here?
All right. And charge. Let's charge. Okay.
Why not?